Good evening, you're watching The Buck Stops Here. It's a big developing story on the program tonight. India's Navy Chief Admiral DK Joshi has resigned. This after the latest submarine mishap this morning, in which two officers are still missing. All efforts are on to locate them after a fire broke out on INS Sindhuratna. Remember, Admiral Joshi still had 15 months left in his term as Navy Chief. This is an unprecedented development, and many are asking, if Admiral Joshi has resigned, why should the Defence Minister be exempt from the same moral responsibility that Admiral Joshi has taken? We'll have much more on this huge developing story at this moment in just a few minutes. Also, coming up on the program, BJP Party President Rajnath Singh makes an offer to apologize for any mistakes the BJP may commit while addressing the BJP's minority cell. It's clearly an attempt to reach out to the Muslim voter, but it's created confusion. What is he resigning? What is he offering to apologize for? The BJP is already saying it's not for 2002, it's not for the past, it's for future mistakes that the party may make. What does that even mean? As we said, is Rajnath Singh's offer to apologize more confusing than conciliatory? Also coming up on that, and on his own very controversial description of Narendra Modi as impotent for his handling of the 2002 riots, Foreign Affairs Minister Salman Khurshid will be facing off with senior BJP leader Prakash Javadekar, standing by those controversial comments that have actually handed a potent political weapon of criticism to the BJP.
What else can I say? I can say that he is incompetent, and incompetence is enough to describe the kind of mayhem that was caused in Gujarat. So there has to be a stronger word, and the stronger word is impotent.
Let's get started with our top story this evening. Admiral DK Joshi, India's Navy Chief, has resigned with 15 months still to go for his tenure. Let's go across to my colleague and our Strategic Affairs Editor Nitin Gokhale to get more on this story. Nitin, of course, we have seen a spate of recent mishaps when it comes to the Indian Navy. The most grave among them, of course, was the sinking of the Sindhu Rakshak, in which 18 personnel were killed. Even this morning in the Sindhuratna incident, we have 2 personnel missing. The statement of resignation, however, has come from the Defence Ministry, not from the Navy Chief himself. You're outside the Navy Chief's or the former Navy Chief's residence since his resignation has been accepted. What are you hearing off camera? What is the story behind this resignation?
Well, Barkha, there are lots of strands to this. As you will recall, there have been these spate of accidents and misjudgments as they have been described. Errors of judgments happen in a large navy like the Indian Navy. Remember, it is the largest navy in Asia Pacific. It does a lot of training, a lot of operational deployments, it goes overseas. So lots of these accidents do happen. Some of them are errors of judgment, some are pure bad luck. And a combination of this actually led to a spate of a bunch of 10 to 12 mishaps, if one may call. Some of them very small, some very serious. Couple of captains were removed. But the pressure on Admiral Joshi was building up because he removed a couple of captains for errors of judgment, which is his right. But the pressure from the media, pressure from the ministry, pressure from the minister himself, who said that yes, it's a matter of concern. We have asked him to investigate, but they are also concerned. Those kind of statements, it was building up. But let me tell you that this resignation has come as a bolt from the blue, even for the closest aides and advisors of the Admiral Joshi, who was the Navy Chief till this evening. Nobody expected this to happen, and I have spoken to a range of officers from juniors to senior most, and everybody is shocked. Nobody expected this to happen, but they all, it's a mixed feeling that the Admiral Joshi has kept the highest traditions of military leadership in resigning, taking moral responsibility, saying the buck stops with him, and therefore is resigning. But also at the same time, the Navy personnel and across armed forces, people are asking, what about people above him? What about the bureaucrats? What about the politicians? What about Mr. Antony, who is the Defence Minister, the longest serving Indian Defence Minister for more than 7 years now? And on his watch, there have been scams, there have been cancellations, there have been scuttling of various contracts which have not taken off. And therefore, who is responsible for the old and aging fleet of submarines, for instance? In 1999, the Indian Navy asked for 20 submarines to be built over the next 15 years. Today, only 6 are under construction. We don't know what is going to happen after this. So, various strands in this, and I think he has taken a moral stand and has risen in the eyes of his own men. Barka?
Now, Nitin, stay with us. You raised some very interesting questions there. The fact is that if Admiral DK Joshi should take moral responsibility, why is everyone else in the system exempt? Why is, for example, the bureaucrats in charge of the of all of these operations exempt? Why is AK Antony himself exempt? Should Mr. Antony also be taking moral responsibility? Should Mr. Antony also be resigning? For those of you who are just joining us, let's just take you through once again. And Nitin, stay with us. We'll be introducing our guest shortly as well. Let's take you through what has happened. The Navy Chief, India's Navy Chief DK Joshi has resigned. He still had 15 months to go before his term was to get over. This is after the latest submarine mishap in which 2 officers are still missing. Fire and smoke was spotted this morning on the INS Sindhu Ratna. 7 sailors were hospitalized. They were hospitalized. They're said to be stable at this point. A statement from the Ministry of Defence says that Admiral Joshi has resigned, taking moral responsibility because of the spate of recent incidents that have and mishaps that have taken place. Is the Navy Chief essentially holding up a moral mirror to our politicians and our bureaucrats? Yes, there have been 10 naval mishaps in the last 7 months, and we need to discuss those, but should other heads roll as well? What is the message that's going out to the larger military community? Should AK Antony take the same moral responsibility that the Navy Chief has, and where does this leave the modernization and acquisition program of the Indian military? Let's introduce our guest. With me in the studio is Admiral Raja Menon, former Assistant Chief of Naval Staff Operations, and also joining me on the program, we're joined by Admiral Suresh Bangara, former Chief of the Southern Naval Command. Let me start with you, Admiral Menon. What do we make of this resignation? Is it as it should have been?
The resignation of a service chief is a big event. It's supposed to shake people. It's supposed to shake the system. But the government had 2 choices.
Yeah.
One was to refuse
to accept
the resignation.
Yeah.
In which case, the government would have indicated to the chief that they still have confidence in him to sort out the errors that have occurred in the service.
Yes.
But in accepting his resignation,
yes,
the government has sent a signal that they will, that they accept that this goes beyond the Navy. As you quite rightly said, that Admiral Joshi's resignation will raise his profile among the people in the Navy. But what about in the nation? What will it do to his profile in the nation? What happens to the fact that he was laboring under constraints over which he had no control? He's not complaining. All he's doing is resigning.
Do you believe the government should not have accepted his resignation, or do you believe that given the very grave mishaps that have taken place, 10 at last count in the last 7 months, and we will discuss those, the correct thing was to not isolate the naval chief as being the only person responsible, and other heads should either roll or other people should be resigning as well?
I entirely agree with that. I think the government should not have accepted his resignation, because firstly, the number of events, that is 12 or 10, there is no magic number. Supposing it had been 4 or 5, would that have been cause for the Navy Chief to resign? The issue is that, as far as I am concerned, there was only one major incident, and that was the loss of the submarine, Sindhu Rakshak.
The Sindhu Rakshak, yeah.
The other incidents are incidents which often arise as a result of the boldness and the elan that commanding officers show in the way they handle their ships. And it's tragic to cripple that initiative and that elan by suggesting that the Navy Chief pay with his career for the errors.
I want to explore what you're saying in depth in a moment, but you're saying the Navy Chief did the correct thing by offering to resign or by resigning, but the government could have and should have rejected that resignation.
That's my opinion. The government should have rejected, unless
because is this going to demoralize the military community?
Yes, definitely. Unless the government was prepared to say that if the Navy Chief goes, we accept that this is a major catastrophe in the hierarchy of the nation, and we intend to clean up the system. But the sad tragedy is that Admiral Joshi will probably retire, go to his private house, take his pension, and the government will continue business as normal. That is what I think is tragic.
Yeah, and Nitin, you of course did raise that question that if Admiral Joshi has taken this responsibility, what about AK Antony? Very interesting from Admiral Raja Menon, of course one of the most experienced submariners in this country, to say that look, you can't count all of these mishaps in the same, you can't place them in the same bucket, and some actually do happen because of over enthusiasm, because of bravado, because of elan, not necessarily mismanagement. So I'm going to park that thought with you and just ask Admiral Bangar whether he agrees with Admiral Raja Menon that the government should not have accepted this resignation. Let me argue it another way. There are those who would say that the buck stops with the leader of a team, and in this case the leader of the team was the Navy Chief, that he did the correct thing and the government may not have had any option but to accept that resignation. I'm not saying this is what I think, because I tend to think that the Navy Chief should not be isolated in taking responsibility at all. So I'm going to put my personal opinion on the table. But let me ask you what some others would say, Admiral Bangar. They'd say the buck has to stop with the team leader. The team leader was the Navy Chief.
I'd like to make 2 or 3 points. One is, I want to congratulate Admiral for resigning. In the armed forces, we don't compare ourselves with the civilian system of accountability. The accountability in the armed forces is quite clear. And we take the responsibility for what goes wrong. It starts from a ship. The commanding officer of a ship, he takes the responsibility for what goes wrong even when he is not on the bridge sometimes. There have been excellent officers who have taken the responsibility and paid the price for it. That is what we are trained to do. So we don't care whether the Ministry of Defence, anybody resigns or not. It is never their ethos. It has never been a practice amongst politicians or otherwise. So I'm very happy that he's taken the step.
Do you believe the government should have, do you agree with Admiral Raja Menon that the government had the option to reject his resignation?
Barka, the moment the government does it, the responsibility shifts to the government. So they'll never do that. They're quite happy to sacrifice someone. That has always been the culture of the ministry. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Defence in India is filled with people who have absolutely no knowledge about the armed forces, and they gain knowledge whilst they are sitting on their chair, and therefore they don't even understand the traditions of the armed forces. So that's another story and that's another battle. Right now, I think Admiral Joshi has set an example. No chief has resigned in India, although there have been many chiefs who have resigned in the UK and other countries, or taking the responsibility. He's not the first one as a chief in the world. He's certainly, sacking is different from resigning, and resigning takes a lot more courage.
And of course, Admiral Bhagwat was removed, and you're absolutely right to draw that distinction between being sacked and resigning. I just want to bring in Nitin into this conversation. Nitin, both our guests this evening, very senior voices from the military, saying for the government to have rejected that resignation would have been to bring the focus onto itself. That's exactly what it did not want to do. Now, what's very ironic is, on one hand, you have in election season this same government quoting the fauji with one rank, one pension, positioning it as Rahul Gandhi's pet project. On the other hand, when I'm hearing Admiral Menon and Admiral Bangar speak, I'm sensing a cynicism. I'm sensing a deep cynicism here that the buck is actually being passed to the military. Not saying that Admiral Joshi does not have to be accountable, but that Admiral Joshi was not the only person accountable. Nitin.
That's right, Barkha. In fact, this one rank, one pension has evoked such cynicism amongst both the serving and the retired community that all of them I have spoken to have said that this is just a ploy to try and woo at the very last moment the electorate, the so-called large electorate of the Faujis. And therefore people have seen through this, because for 10 years the government did not accept this, didn't do this, and therefore it's a matter that everybody has seen through, and nobody is going to accept that this was done for their benefit. It was done for electoral benefit is what everybody has come to that conclusion. But that be that as it may, there was one more incident of a similar kind which happened during Admiral Arun Prakash's time.
Yes.
He was under pressure when there was a media report against him in a section of the media, and then he had offered to resign, or he was contemplating. That time, the current president, Pranab Mukherjee, was defence minister. He persuaded him and he told him not to resign. He backed him. So there are incidents, and there was one more army chief in the 60s, General K.S. Thimaiya, who had resigned, and Pandit Nehru, who was the Prime Minister, he had, General Thimayya had resigned because differences with the then Defence Minister Krishna Menon. But Pandit Nehru, who was a taller personality that time, persuaded General Thimayya, and he took back his resignation, and he was never the same man again in the eyes of the military. So in that sense, there have been a couple of these incidents earlier. General Sinha, SK Sinha had resigned as Vice Chief and he was passed over, but that was another matter. But this one has set an example for topmost military leadership, topmost military ethos, and that has actually had a mixed feeling amongst the military community that I have been able to speak to in the last couple of hours. Barka?
Very interesting. I was going to bring up Admiral Arun Prakash's example and how Pranab Mukherjee actually then walked across to his room and said, don't go. Admiral Bangar, you wanted to come in there. Let me ask you bluntly, I'm going to pose this as a very direct question because you can't be mealy-mouthed about this. Do you believe that now that Admiral Joshi has resigned, AK Antony should resign as well?
No, I'll explain the relationship in the Ministry of Defence now.
Yes.
What Nitin quoted was an instance where the Prime Minister was always in direct touch with the armed forces and the chiefs.
Yes.
It never happens now. I don't think the Prime Minister has any time for a chief. Now, when you have that sort of a relationship, there is the Prime Minister who can step in and say, no, he shan't go. But imagine Mr. Antony doing that. I don't think he had very healthy relations with the previous army chief, or he doesn't have that sort of a rapport which he ought to have with the chiefs, which happened during many years ago. The RRM and the RM had very close relations with the chiefs, and that's the way it's meant to be, and the Prime Minister too. It has not happened since then, so I'm not surprised, and I don't think anybody is going to quit in the government.
Admiral Menon, does that make you cynical that nobody is going to quit in the government? And what I'm hearing is, do you believe Mr. Antony should quit? Actually it doesn't matter, because the difference between Mr. Antony quitting and Admiral Joshi quitting is that Admiral Joshi had 15 months left and AK Antony has 1 month left. So let's also make that difference clear, that AK Antony's tenure is already over.
See, everyone knows that the management of higher defence is very sick, and people have tried to mend that for years, ever since the Kargil Committee report and K. Subramaniam publishing it in the open press. Attempts have been made to correct the system, but the system has stonewalled itself, headed mainly by the Defence Minister and the Defence bureaucracy. And one of the aspects of having a very weak Defence Minister is that the bureaucracy tends to run amok, and an event like the chief resigning is meant to clear up the system. What I fear is that General Joshi, Admiral Joshi has held himself to the higher standards of public morality, but no one else is going to follow him.
Do you believe Mr. Antony, even for symbolic value for this 1 month remaining, should quit?
Well, unless he had the option, he of course had the option to tell Admiral Joshi not to go.
Now that Admiral Joshi has gone.
Yes, now that he has gone, he has got to make good his promise of being a proper Defence Minister, which he is not.
By doing what?
By cleaning up the system.
Now, I want to ask you, and Admiral Bangar as well, you said that only the Sindhu Rakshak mishap in which 18 personnel were killed is the one that stands out for you as a huge, gigantic mistake. What about the other incidents? What about the aircraft carrier catching fire? What about Irravat running aground? What about Sindhu Ratna today? What about INS Talwar colliding with a fishing trawler near Ratnagiri? How do you say that some are actually because of the inherent elan, as you called it, and only Sindhu Rakshak is the grave error?
You know, there is a famous story about a destroyer captain who collides with another ship, and somebody makes him a signal saying, what are your intentions now? And he signals back saying, I intend to buy a farm. I mean, this is what happens, that when you take the responsibility in command, as Admiral Bangara was saying, that you hold yourself to a standard which is not understood in the civilian ethos. And what we have seen here is that Admiral Joshi has held himself to a standard which is not going to be followed.
And do you believe that Admiral Joshi in some ways was, as the leader of his men and women, was not responsible for these mishaps in the ultimate sense?
You know, Napoleon used to ask his marshals, I don't care how competent you are you lucky? Admiral Joshi was unlucky. That's all there is to it. As far as the number of incidents piling up are concerned, he was just plain unlucky. Except for this one incident, which is serious. Yeah. That is the Sindhu.
Admiral Bangar, do you agree? Do you agree that Admiral Joshi was just unlucky, and and Admiral Menon raises the point that at which numerical point do you now say, okay, too many incidents have happened? It could be, is it 3, is it 4, is it 7, is it 20?
Barka, accidents do happen in any armed forces of the world, but bunching of accidents that have happened, 12 of them incidents or accidents involving submarines and ships, I think is a cause for some concern. And that would have been addressed by the Navy by having a flag officer or a committee going into it, and our committees come out with absolutely spot on reports on who should be sacked or who is to be held accountable. There's no fear of that. But that should have been done, because this bunching up is not usual, it's unusual. Okay. And therefore, to that extent, I think there has to be introspection. The second point I want to make is that the Defence Minister is not Secretary of Navy like in the US. He is the Defence Minister for all 3-4 services. He ought to have resigned many times over on issues of the last chief and all the embarrassment that was caused. He should have resigned on those. So he had opportunities to resign many times, and Navy is only one of the services that he handles. So I don't think he'll ever take responsibility for
Very
this.
important point. That is not just about the Navy. Just last comments from all of you. Nitin, I'll start with you briefly, please.
Yes, in fact, I was just coming to this. In fact, you'll remember, Varka, we had discussed this internally about this bunch of incidents in the Navy and where they're serious. And I tend to agree with both the admirals here that in a large Navy like this, accidents and incidents will happen. He was plain unlucky. This was a bad phase, like the Air Force suffered a bad phase similarly in the last decade, where the MiGs were falling like 9 pins, and they were called flying coffins at one point in time. So therefore, to hold him accountable was unfair, but he is held himself accountable for that, and therefore everybody is going to salute him for what he has done. That cannot be expected of the same standards from the civilian leadership. That's the tragedy in India about civil-military relationships.
Admiral Bangar, last word to you. We do, and to Admiral Menon, we do remember a rare incident of a Madhavrao Scindia, who was Defence Minister, if I'm not wrong, in the 90s, or he was Civil Aviation Minister. He actually resigned after an accident, but we don't see our ministers doing that too often. Lal Bahadur Shastri, maybe. I mean, that's another name that comes to mind. Yeah.
Well, as I said earlier, the military ethos, the military discipline, the military tradition is quite different from what is applicable to the civilian world. So to that extent, we need to have people who will be accountable. It could have been somebody in the command, in the field, it could have been the chief, but somebody has to be accountable. And I think he did the right thing because of the unusual bunching up of a series of incidents. It is not usual, and therefore he has taken the responsibility for it.
To you, the last word. Is the real worry that there has been a discordant relationship, you know, one could say, between the civilian establishment and the military in the last few years? You had the whole controversy around General VK saying, you now have this moment where Admiral Joshi has done the right thing, but no doubt the military community, because I can hear it in both what you and Admiral Bangar are saying, are going to be upset and angry tonight.
Absolutely. The relationship normally is bad. Occasionally it becomes catastrophic, but it's never good. And this relationship is primarily the cause of most problems.
And do you believe Admiral Joshi has done the right thing, as Admiral Bangara says?
Absolutely. He's held himself to the highest standards of service behavior. But I feel cynical that this will be like casting pearls before swine. That's the tragedy.
We leave it there. Admiral Menon and Admiral Bangara, Nitin Gokhale, thanks for joining us on the buck stops here. Very important questions. The forge holding itself up to a standard of public accountability that we rarely see from our politicians. And the question we leave you with tonight is that if Admiral Joshi is morally responsible, is Mr. AK Antony or the Defence Secretary not as liable?